Today we're going to discuss Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling with an emphasis on how a knight of faith might see current environmental destruction. And this will be followed by ruminations about how Christianity and indigenous spirituality may be able to agree upon a need for a more than scientific, more than human-centric world. Followed by potential implications, perhaps, for the classroom, because, of course, children and what they learn are the future. Okay, I'm here with Dan Sherven. So maybe we should start by establishing our personal ethics. So, Dan, maybe we'll start with this one. What is ethics to you?
So a lot of my worldview is like a traditional Christian worldview, essentially. So the primary assumption that I would have in my entire philosophy of life would be that the Logos became flesh, and the Logos is a Greek word which kind of means meaning or story or idea or pattern. And so in Christianity, Jesus is identified as the Logos. He's the Logos before he becomes incarnate as Jesus. So I'm explaining all this because my ethics would be, as much as I often don't agree with them in my actions, intellectually at least I can understand that basically the teachings of Jesus would be my ethics. Although I fall short of them all the time, which isn't necessarily a contradiction. It's just the nature of trying to strive to an objective value. I see in the show notes you have kind of like a monoculture of the Western University, which is something that I wouldn't even necessarily disagree with, because I do think that there is an objective reality and that all truth claims are claims about corresponding to that objective reality. But yeah, that's kind of what I would say is a brief overview of my ethic. And then the other thing that's important in understanding all that is that if a person's Christian, they believe God became man, and so human being is central in the cosmos, not only in the created universe, which this is where there could be some bridges between Christianity and like not such an extreme version of capitalism, where even, I'm going to get the Latin wrong, but the Pope in 2015 put out Laudaro Si, which was basically just about environmentalism, because if you're a Christian, you believe that reality is created by God and therefore should be cared for to a certain, what the extent of that is, and in particular cases is up for debate, but there's definitely some agreement there between Christianity and kind of just a worldview that more takes care of nature.
Well, thanks, Dan. How would you say that you can deepen your understanding of ethics and perhaps your faith? And it, to me, am I wrong to assert that like those two are definitely intertwined intimately for you, as you said?
Yeah. I think that they should be for people. I think that if a person doesn't have a cohesive worldview in terms of all the different things they think, then it doesn't really make sense, their worldview as a whole. Sorry, what was it? Ethics and
Faith.
Ethics and faith, yeah. And even the word faith is an interesting thing, because generally now people take it to mean sort of something like believing something without evidence, kind of like they're stuck in the realm of ideas when they're thinking about faith.
Mm-hmm.
But I would take faith more to be like an ontological stance, with the word ontological kind of meaning like level of being. Like despite all the tragedy and evil in the world, you're still choosing to stand on the side of a God. And the Greek word that's translated as belief in the New Testament kind of has elements of that. It's more of like a stance with someone, as opposed to just believing in ideas that you might not have other ideas which would prompt you to believe in that first idea, if that makes sense. It's not so much about intellectual belief. It's more about like where you're betting your life, essentially, where you're standing. So 100% I would think that ethics and faith go together. If you believe that God became man and that objective reality itself became a human being, then you're going to have a human-centric worldview, not only in terms of like physical entities, but even like metaphysical, spiritual things with humanity at the center. I'm thinking here of angels and demons, which people kind of, because of art, how angels and demons are represented in art as red creatures with pitchforks, or kind of humans with wings. That's kind of the worldview, or the view of that a lot of people have. But really, a person could just think of angels or demons as patterns that kind of influence a person. Like one way that's helpful to think about this might be something like Facebook, that it doesn't have a body in the way that an angel or demon has a body. Like Facebook can only exist because everybody else functions as the body, but there's kind of like a spirit of Facebook that, infects, or whatever word you want to use, all the people who are using Facebook. And so you could think of like addiction's a really good example for demons, where it's kind of like a thought pattern that's attacking you that's negative, whereas the angelic one would be like something that's uplifting for you. But yeah, anyway, to answer the first question, I do think ethics and faith are extremely intertwined.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, my mind kind of went to addiction when you mentioned angels and demons and that kind of thing, and sort of the desire to kind of fall back into like a bad habit versus overcoming said habit and finding some sort of enrichment or enlightenment in your life. Okay. And you know what? That to me kind of gets us into, perhaps, I feel like that's a good kind of bridge into Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, which is one of the topics that we read about and discussed in the class. And, so we kind of wrestled with sort of the Night of Infinite Resignation versus the Night of Faith, who Kierkegaard, and I have to give him credit, I was fascinated by sort of the image that he paints of the Night of Faith. To me, it was inspiring in a way. It was awing in a way. I'm not sure quite the words I want to describe it with. But yeah, I like how he dealt with kind of the aesthetic, ethical, religious, and then sort of the Night of Faith kind of realms of being. And maybe we'll start here. Like to me, I thought of sort of the aesthetic as sort of just where, you're getting caught up in maybe trivial sort of consumerist kind of endeavors. You're not really looking forward to anything bigger. Would you agree with that assertion, or
Just in general about people?
yeah?
Yeah, 100%. Even myself in my personal life, going on a bit of a job search, like you have to make decisions about this job pays more, but it's not meaningful. And like a lot of people, unfortunately, I think live their whole lives kind of where they have a job that's primarily for the money or the status and not for the meaning. And I don't really think it gets you the life that you want to have. Like in a sense it does, because you can make a whole bunch of money, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't think you're ever going to have the kind of fulfillment that makes you excited about your life or makes your life so meaningful that you even begin to wander into religious questions. Now, with that said, sometimes people can have such a meaningless life that they end up wandering into existential or religious philosophical questions kind of thing. But yeah, I definitely think that people get caught up in kind of just impressing people they don't even like through money or material objects, etc. And they structure their whole life around acquiring material objects, which I don't think is going to sustain them when there's tragedy or evil around them in their lives.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know, for me, when I read Kierkegaard, I kind of agree. I kind of thought like I would fluctuate between those in terms of whatever the hopefully altruistic goal that is that I'm pursuing. I would find personally that you're kind of going in. It's sort of this spectrum of kind of being, and to me, honestly, it could change multiple times even within a day, just kind of based on external sort of factors and stressors and things like that. When you're like you say, trying to follow the angels of good altruistic actions versus regressing into something more destructive. For me personally, I feel like it's kind of a battle every day to stay on that course of living a more ethical life.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I'm the same, where even hour to hour your priorities can change. This is one thing that maybe I should bring up just in terms of understanding Christianity, where a lot of it is about, and really, a lot of it is about attention. Like idolatry in the Bible is essentially God's not the highest point of your attention. So anyway, the reason I'm bringing and you're putting something else as the highest point of your attention, such as the addiction you have, at that time when you re-engage in the addiction, it's the most important thing. It's more important than God, you could say. It's more important. It becomes your highest value. So anyway, the reason I'm going through all this is just because you can see it in people's lives long term if money is their God, essentially. I've been thinking a lot about Jesus in the New Testament. The Old Testament God of money is Mammon. And there's a quote of Jesus where he's saying that you have to choose one or the other, Mammon or God. And you can't serve both these masters. You kind of have to decide where you go. Now with Kierkegaard, his Night of Faith idea, this is where I think it's interesting or useful to understand kind of faith as being an ontological stance. Like, yes, for example, this job pays less and the career trajectory for most people is a lower one, but perhaps you are willing to bet on. Now, to explain this better, the logos, which I mentioned earlier, Jesus, some of the meanings would be truth or meaning itself. So are you willing to bet on truth and meaning if you think truth and meaning are ultimate reality and our God, or do you want to make the highest point of your attention money and essentially follow that path? You're not really being a knight of faith. You're not really standing with what you believe ontologically or even propositionally, meaning like idea-wise. So anyway, when I think of Kierkegaard, I do think that to really be a knight of faith is not about like, in one of my philosophy classes, the example was given of a suicide bomber where they just take it on faith, and they were meaning faith in the sense of like ideas that their cause is so right that they're just going to act this way. But in a sense, that kind of has nothing, I shouldn't say nothing, but it's not really what's meant by faith, and I don't think it's what Kierkegaard was intending either. I think Kierkegaard is more saying like, are you willing to bet on the goodness of existence and reality itself or not, even despite what the odds might look like at the outset?
For me, that's kind of a far cry from the harshness, I guess, of the Abraham story when it's just such a personal story, right? Because he's killing his son.
Yeah.
But to me, you kind of put it in a way that is way more tangible and realistic and frankly achievable, right? Like for me, there's a big difference between killing your son and maybe divesting in the belief that money is the be all and end all in terms of success and overall happiness and what's going to lead to a fulfilled life, right? And I guess maybe that's what kind of perturbed me a bit when I first read Kierkegaard, was just that sort of how it's almost romanticized, I guess, the killing of the son in a way. And I don't know or think that was Kierkegaard's intention, but to me it was definitely painted sort of in this very legendary way, I guess we'll say.
One thing I would say about that story is like, so Abraham is like 70 when he leaves his house and goes on his adventure. He leaves his father's house, and he doesn't have any children, and so God promises him a child, and then he and his wife is also like elderly, and they end up having a child. So whether a person wants to take that story as, like, they can take it however they want. I'm just saying what the story is. But with him sacrificing his son, it kind of plays into the idea of attention and idolatry, where because Isaac, Abraham's son, was so unlikely, it was as if Abraham kind of had an idolatry about Isaac, like he was placing Isaac above God. And so kind of what God is doing is being like, no, everything in your life has to be subordinate to God, like you have, including the thing you most love. I'm reminded of the writer C.S. Lewis, who in one of his books is describing hell, and he has a mother there whose son died, and the mother is trapped in hell because she won't put God above the son. She'd rather be in hell just thinking about her son than let go of it and go to heaven with God, kind of thing. So in the story, part of what's happening is that Abraham's being called to sacrifice his highest aim, essentially, which isn't God. And then what's strange about the story is that when Abraham fully commits to it and is about to kill Isaac, an angel stops it from happening. So he gets back the thing that he was sacrificing to God anyway. He ends up not having to give it up, which is kind of like, if you're a parent, like with the C.S. Lewis example, if she were to have her son in the proper place and not higher than God, then she could have her son in heaven, but she'd rather just live in the misery in hell, sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question that I was kind of having. Do you think Kierkegaard paints the Abrahamic story? Is it, what's the word here? Exaggerated in a way just to affect a point, if that makes sense?
I would have to read Kierkegaard again. Like, it's a pretty insane story to begin with.
Yeah. Which almost beckons that it's like, you know, you go into that kind of story and again, I think we're going to get into this later in the podcast, but you know, it's not meant to be literal. It's supposed to be a teachable parable, would you say?
Yeah, I think that's like an unbelievably complicated question. Like, did that actually happen? Like, I don't know, maybe. But like, I don't really think that's the interesting point of it. It's more the story, like the allegorical, metaphorical, whatever parable, like whatever word you want to use, kind of, you know?
Yeah. And for me, growing up in the old secular world, it's like that was the first question that came to mind. It was like, well, where did he get the message in the first place?
Yeah.
And at what point did the angel come and say, hey, no, wait, enough.
Yeah.
And what if the angel didn't come, right? And then, you know, actually one of the thoughts I had when I was writing about it, I was like, well, had the angel not come, would it have been a more of a literal thing like this?
Mm-hmm.
Another sacrificial animal just happens to pop out at that exact moment, and Abraham, takes it as a sign of divine intervention in that scenario, and it's essentially the same story, except now you actually have a tangible animal and sort of intuition on Abraham's part. But anyway, yeah, I thought that was
Well, even the angel thing is like unbelievably complicated. Like, what does that mean if it's like a purely spiritual being that stops him from committing a physical act? Like, did that literally happen? It's like an unbelievably complicated.
yeah. But to me, it's more fun if you look at it sort of taking outside of just hyper focusing on the literal and sort
Definitely.
of crime scene investigation kind of mentality,
Yeah.
and looking into, again, I love the sort of the metaphor of, idolizing other things in our life
Yeah.
and putting those ahead of a god. To me, that has way more tangible, realistic implications, and you can transfer that in all realms of your life. So
There's also, we might get into this later, but there's a question about how ancient people, like the readers and writers of Genesis, would have understood that story, because we, being like the heirs of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution and stuff, we do have that more like forensic, like, would a camera have captured this questioning, scientific questioning about a story like that? Whereas prior to the advent of science, it's not clear at all that people would have taken it to be anything other than the metaphorical type story. Now, there's definitely, you go back, I'm sure, and find people that took it to be literal as well. My point is just that the more metaphorical, allegorical, parable type meaning was probably way more central to the people who wrote it and understood it than now, where we kind of have those more materialistic, like hard
it's a
reality
totally different
questions.
environment
Yeah,
that you're growing up in, where that's emphasized, and that's how we see things. We don't see it because that's the sea we're swimming in.
yeah, exactly.
um I want to ask this one. So how do you think a knight of faith would see environmental destruction?
Well, I think if you, I could answer it in like a Christian way, where like if you think that God's creation is good essentially, and that humans have dominion over it, but at the same time are kind of stewards of it. If there's real environmental destruction, then it's a catastrophe. For a knight of faith who places himself, is trying to ontologically place himself like on the side of goodness. If it's actually destroying reality itself, then like it's a huge problem for someone who's trying to place themselves on the side of goodness. I would say that I'm always hesitant to dive deep in when I hear environmental claims, because I just think it's such a complicated, like,
Mm-hmm.
people make fun of this where it's like weather and climate aren't the same thing, but at the same time, like, we can barely predict the weather. So like to predict like environmental things over centuries, the amount of variables in an equation like that, I'm just always hesitant to say like this is whatever claim is being made is definitively true, and therefore all these extreme actions need to be taken. But at the same time, if those things are true, then yeah, it's a colossal problem for somebody who's trying to place themselves on the side of like the goodness of reality, if reality itself is being destroyed.
Mm-hmm. And to me, it almost puts you in the same camp as somebody that's, say, an atheist, agnostic, doesn't follow a religion, maybe just spiritual in an individual way. To me, you're almost, yeah, you're kind of in the same camp either way, right? If you're
Yeah.
claiming you're following in your own way some kind of ethics. So in a way, I don't know, maybe, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think it's just a collective failure on all of humanity, or particularly those that are uh, consuming more, I guess. And I do like your point, like we can't predict the weather day to day and the climate. But then for me, I think back to the Feral Atlas site, and and to me, it's more multifaceted. And like you say, like insanely complicated, like just in terms of the amount of, we're dealing with, the Earth, like a whole biosphere that has all these different biomes and microcosms of life. And so it's insanely intricately connected. And so, yeah, to make rash sort of predictions. And yet at the same time, and maybe that's a bash on sort of our media and news climate and system, that we always focus on the bad, but it seems like, you're always hearing about the long-term, short-term, you name it, kind of consequences of, and not just in terms of climate change, but collective human actions, and sort of how those kind of influence the environment. And then yeah, what really gets me is kind of, well, at least cause for alarm is just sort of the decrease in biodiversity that I find. That's almost disheartening because we don't even know. For me anyway, as a city dweller, I don't even know what we've collectively lost in the world because you're kind of tied in your little
Yeah, that's fair.
microcosm of a city
Yeah.
in your individual little box. And aside from watching the TV and David Attenborough's special, it can be hard to kind of see the bigger picture, I guess.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
And the media stuff is almost a whole separate question. But
Oh yeah.
like how sometimes, and like I would like to work in media, but I'm not naive to the flaws of like. One thing that I would say about media that people often don't understand, and then maybe we can get more. I'm kind of veering off, but
No, that's okay.
is when you talking about attention, like people take for granted that the media directs attention. Like they are framing what people will take to be important. So, like with the environmental issues, for example, if if the studies are legitimate and everything, like then yeah, it's a global catastrophe that should be front and center in everyone's attention. But whenever there's any questions about the legitimacy of the studies, then I feel those are more swept under the rug in the media. Like it's not as talked about. I mean, another example to just say more quasi not acceptable things would be even during COVID, how the media kind of took for granted the first step in the attentional hierarchy of like, should we be questioning the government narratives about COVID more than we are, and just kind of moved on to taking it for granted. So anyway, those are just my concerns kind of when it comes to the environmental stuff as well, is that the foundational science essentially, I have no idea about science. So a lot of people just take the attitude of like, well, I'll just take for granted whatever I hear about science kind of thing. But as we saw in COVID, like the world was able to kind of drop the whole COVID act and just keep going, even though COVID was entirely real and the end of the world never happened, which was kind of being prophesized. So anyway, I would just say with attention's like a very powerful thing, and like any religious practice will help you understand attention. In Christianity, they kind of use angels and demons as an example. I also meditate all the time and have found that unbelievably useful to just noticing itself and like see, like for mental health, it's unbelievable to just notice when you're just going down a dark pattern for no reason really, and to just like stop and be able to kind of revert back to the present is very useful. But anyway, sorry to ramble about.
Yeah, no, yeah, I like thinking about the media. I find it very interesting, also disheartening.
Yeah.
I kind of when you think about like where does just the average kid kind of get their influence from? Well, they see their parents. If they're lucky, right? Their parents a lot of times they're working, a job or two jobs, heaven forbid. They're usually shipped off to school at say 2 years old because mom and dad have to work. So not to bash babysitters, but again, you're probably not getting the same level of attention that you likely would with a parent. And then so you got to think, well, what's kind of competing for attention, right? And you have, to me, yeah, big corporate apps like Facebook, Google, and the like that, have been kind of influenced by money, frankly, when you kind of boil it down enough. And there's big interest there. And there's also big interest for big omissions and mucking of facts and that kind of thing. And so, yeah, when you get into media, I find it is a rabbit hole, but I think it's one that's worth kind of going down because it's like to be part of the problem of like, how do you get kind of a cohesive society going if you don't have truth and facts or you can't trust it, and then you're going on the internet and it's like, well, like.
No, 100%. Like, and the capitalist, like I'm a capitalist, but you're 100% right. And like when you're using Facebook or any social media, like your attention is the product. Like that's why it's free, is because they can sell advertisements because your attention is.
And it's insanely, it to me, it's scary how much a company can know about you and your future behaviors, especially at the dawn of like an AI powered age where things can really get out of hand.
But. And even like the capitalism thing with the parenting is something I think about a lot too, like where unfortunately for most people they want or need or whatever their situation is 2 incomes, and so the children go to daycare or whatever, which is not the end of the world or anything, but it's just like they're not being raised by the parents in the home in the same way that they might have been decades ago if you had a parent who could stay home. But like all this gets into like huge economy issues of just like it's not
Economy issues. It's women's issues because it's
Yeah.
like women want to work, rightfully so, and nobody necessarily wants to stay at home and kind of
Yeah.
give up a career. Yeah, my wife and I were kind of going through that now, and jokingly, of course. And you
Yeah.
can always get the babysitter,
Yeah.
but it's still kind of you're always second guessing. Well,
Yeah.
should I work part time
Yeah.
and then have say 2 days extra with
Yeah.
with the young one, especially when they're kind of 0 to 5 sort of
Yeah.
age.
It's super hard decision making, but I do think it's real.
Yeah.
Just the
And then even questions around the nuclear family and what that
Definitely.
looks like and
yeah.
and how it's so siloed and
Yeah.
I don't know, and how you sort of result in that. Yeah, moving on. So you weren't talking about Abraham in your article, and I think it was titled Neil deGrasse Tyson Reinterprets Faith. But to me, your piece raised some interesting points about deGrasse's interpretation of Genesis. And to me, it related to sort of pit stops that we've had in this course around indigenous spirituality and how it might be a necessity in an age of sort of a human-centric and sort of a environmental kind of precarious age. Sorry, I forget where I was going with this.
Spirit and matter, maybe.
Spirit and matter, yeah, and how that we kind of have to, instead of divorcing them like a lot of us have in the 21st century, is, I don't know, to me, your article and possibly your beliefs that you have now kind of coincided with some of the things that we touched on in our class, and I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. Basically, in the article, I was just making the case that kind of when Neil deGrasse Tyson makes fun of Genesis, well, I shouldn't say makes fun, but talks about Genesis as a literalist scientific document, essentially, that it's 100% not what was being done when Genesis was written, like 1,500 years, if not more, prior to, and probably a lot more than that, prior to the advent of science itself. This is kind of what we were talking about earlier, where the ancient worldview is just not that concerned with matter as divorced from spirit and is more concerned with the unity of the two. And I mean, you get interesting things in Christianity, like in philosophy, they have what they call the mind-body problem, which is just how does your mind make your body move? Like, what is the relationship? It seems like mind and body are so fundamentally distinct that they could never have an interaction without one of them giving up what they are and becoming the other thing. So in Christianity, and it's bizarre that like this was thought of, I mean, at least 2,000 years ago. It's probably all throughout Judaism as well prior to that, they view the human person as being an entire composite, which is why they believe in the, like a lot of people kind of think that Christians think that when you die, your soul kind of goes to the afterlife, which is like sort of true, but that's kind of more Plato's thinking, which Plato did influence Christianity a lot. But the Christian view is more that mind and body are united in a person, and that it's the resurrection of the body is what the Nicene Creed talks about. So anyway, my point with all this is just that the Christian worldview, although it's not a scientific claim in a sense, has a unity of spirit and matter and mind and body, even in the human person, let alone in the rest of reality. So I just think I don't know if it's disingenuine or if Tyson is just not that familiar with how these people actually think, but I just think these old stories are not about science. Like I think in the article there's a part about, he's talking about how at the end of the world, or the Genesis is talking about how at the end of the world, stars will fall out of the heavens, and deGrasse Tyson is just kind of saying how obviously this would never happen, sort of thing. Whatever he's saying, like doesn't make any sense scientifically. And I think in the article too, I'm just kind of saying how it's better to view this metaphorically in the sense of like the highest points of our attention fall down when you find yourself in hell, which it could happen in this life and does happen to people all the time in this life, to where and this is kind of the idolatry thing where like whatever you are worshiping, whatever is the highest point in the sky for you up in the heavens, comes crashing down when everything around you comes crashing down. So yeah. And then the objection people would have is just that now Christians say these stories are metaphorical, et cetera, because science has proved them not to be scientific documents. But as we've been saying, like, seems like it's been there since the beginning, because it doesn't make any sense that they would have been trying to do science at that time, even though there's some philosophers who were kind of doing something that was like early astronomy, like a type science-y thing. And then the other key piece of that article is that like a creationist school, these are the people who would be like, well, Christians who we could go back and find Noah's Ark kind of thing. Like they also have a literalist interpretation. They kind of like
Mm-hmm.
even locally, there's places that kind of teach.
Yeah, I like how you mentioned that in the article. Sort of the other
Yeah.
extreme of they're building the ark and they're
yeah,
the dinosaurs and humans
Yeah.
are riding them and this kind of thing.
Yeah. Like because I don't find that's doing anyone any favors. Like it's just making people not want to believe in the metaphorical truths of Christianity, essentially.
Yeah, and I think that's part of where they get some of the bad reputation, or
Definitely.
maybe it turns people off, is that they
Definitely.
see kind of people not acknowledging, that side of things that we can fairly simply at this point, when we have the tests, kind of
Yeah.
prove that are wrong, right?
Yeah.
And so you get caught up in the literal, and back to our whole discussion about Abraham. It's like, well, again, when you look at those documents, I like how you said it. You it's a spiritual document. It's not intended to be literal. It's
Yeah.
you kind of have in the back of your mind, how am I supposed to live a good life? I'm reading this and sort of trying to get some sort of value out of it,
Yeah.
but not necessarily taking it literally.
Yeah, even like another important piece is just that like the monasteries historically that then became the universities. Like a lot of the first scientists were Christians, and I kind of point out Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, in that article.
Like the Christian belief in truth
Yeah.
was what sort of stemmed the rise of science.
Yeah, they believed that reality was intelligible, and so we can figure out what the rules of reality are, essentially. And this goes all the way back to Christ being the truth with a capital T and a belief in objective reality, to where then these Christian scientists could start doing science because they believed that they could figure out the objective laws of reality. So Nietzsche is pointing out that in a sense Christianity died by its own hand because as science developed, then it started to turn itself on a lot of the more literal claims that some people in Christianity would have been making.
Mm-hmm. And to me, I think you say in the article, science and religion can live totally cohesively. And to me, if I had to kind of speculate, it would be that, like you can be for scientific innovation and, some of the things that it's brought to us and our societies. But maybe there's a place for Christian ethics to sort of evaluate, decisions that were made, particularly the big ones, like around assisted maid, right? Things like that, where, then Christian ethics kind of has the place of, kind of fighting the sort of, raising the question, right? Should we be doing this or should we kind of claw it back? And to me, that's kind of where I've seen Christianity kind of have a big effect, I guess, in today's day and age. What's your kind of thoughts there?
Yeah, definitely. Because otherwise you end up with like I'm just reminded of some of like Stalin or Mao, of these like even like Hitler, where you end up with these like purely scientific, but that's not fair to say scientific, but they are just completely atheist systems that
Mm-hmm.
like if you have no appeal to any objective source of ethics, like a god or anything, and Nietzsche this is Nietzsche's quote about God is dead kind of thing, and we've killed him and we'll never wash the blood off our hands, because he predicted basically that communism would kill tens of millions of people in the future as soon as Christianity was removed, and because that was like the world ethical, you could use the word ethical, but like religious ethical system, and if you cut that away, it like what seems to have happened with like fascism and communism, etc., these totalitarian systems that just killed tens of millions of people.
Millions, yeah.
Is like, it's not like people just become like Sam Harris, like super rational. Like that's a very rare person.
You're talking to people that may very well have seen the Abrahamic story as a literal interpretation, and they're like, okay, well now what?
Yeah. And even if they didn't, but you destroy the like metaphorical significance of it for people because the literal significance falls apart, it's like they don't have an ethical grounding. And like you kind of even see this in the present day with like sometimes people get like so obsessed with politics that it's like a religion for them, kind of, because they don't have a place to put the religious impulse. So kind of like the messianic thing gets placed into politics.
Mm-hmm.
Like on whatever side of the political spectrum, doesn't really matter, but it's just seems like
Yeah, you can have green parties that are fairly popular, may not win, but people follow it quite devoutly.
Yeah.
And likewise on the right.
Yeah.
So
One other thing I'd say about the spirit and matter is like, so I'm a Catholic, or try to be Catholic, but
mhm.
so they believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, and people hear that and think it means like you could put it under a microscope and like Jesus
I
would
think
be
you
in
had to
there.
talk about this. That
Probably.
because I was
But like historically, that's not what they meant at all. It was like a thing where Aristotle used substance to talk about like the essence of something, and then accident meant like the physical properties surrounding it. It's like the essence of Matt, and then like the accidents, like your beard, or like stuff that doesn't have to be part of you, would be like the accidents. So anyway, Thomas Aquinas is like a saint, and he was like a
Mhm.
philosopher type guy, and so he's in like the 12th century, 13th century, and so he's using Aristotle's categories to talk about the Eucharist. But then by the time of the Protestant Reformation, the word substance, which kind of meant essence, had come to mean like how we view substance now, where it's like used for drugs or like some kind of material like thing you could knock on. So anyway, the Protestants rejected the real substance of Christ in the Eucharist, but they're using the word substance to mean that scientific meaning. So anyway, my point with all this is just that what the Catholics believe is that like at a spiritual or metaphysical level of reality, there's a miracle where Christ is present in it, not in a scientific way where you could ever observe it with a microscope or anything like that, but in like a purely spiritual way that's outside of what science can do. Another thing I guess I should mention for people is just that
I don't know. To me, it comes to mind like almost in the collective minds of the people that are partaking in the
yeah, like I
in
would
the
say
mass.
it's
in a
more
way,
than that, but
like,
it's also that.
yeah. Well, and for me, particularly, the collective agreement is part of, at least for me, what makes it powerful in a way.
Yeah, definitely.
Like you're in a room full of people that you're mutually acknowledging that you're gonna, strive to
Yeah.
implement this sort of worldview, way of seeing the world, ethics, and
Yeah.
decision making, and maybe it's a way of kind of keeping you accountable in a way.
Yeah. It's
Or
definitely
at
all
least
that.
inspiring you, perhaps, or I'm sure there's a lot of different angles that you could kind of get on board with it. But
Yeah. I saw in the show notes you had a quote from an article I'd done about Mathieu Pajot.
yeah, okay, I'm glad you're bringing that. Go ahead.
Yeah, so this is like extremely complicated, but like in the quote he's talking about heaven and how Jesus says heaven's not the only important thing if it doesn't produce if something doesn't produce fruits.
Yeah, should I? How about I read the
sure,
quote?
yeah.
I'll read the quote and then you can
Sure.
comment. So here's the quote. This is something we don't often talk about in Christianity religion. The idea that heaven is the only thing that's important. That's kind of false. I mean, Jesus doesn't say that either. If it doesn't produce fruit, it's not much.
Yeah, so now Mathieu Pajot is basically an author, and his brother has one of the more popular Christian podcasts. And in their work, they talk a lot about how like Matthew's book goes through this in depth, but how like the words heaven and earth, when we hear them now, we kind of think like either afterlife for heaven or like the sky, like heavens kind of thing, and earth we
Immediately,
think like, and earth we think like the planet Earth. But what they're trying to argue is that like for the people who wrote the Bible, what they're trying to get across is that heaven is like, you could say it's the afterlife, but it's like meaning itself. It's kind of like the psychological or spiritual or mental half of reality. And earth, because at the time of writing they only knew about earth, is like a stand-in for material reality. So heaven's kind of like spiritual reality and earth is like material reality. And then like man's role is to be like a unifier of them both. So like Christ will talk about like seeds a lot, where like a seed is like heaven, where like you see a little seed of a plant and like it doesn't look like much, but if you plant it in the earth, it can like blossom into a big, huge thing. And then the other thing I'd say about this is like Christians think that Christ is the Logos, which is borrowed from Greek philosophy in part, and that one of the meanings of Logos is like meaning itself. So in that sense, like heaven would be unity with Christ, which would mean unity with meaning itself. And so you would be united to God and live eternally. But the Christian contention and kind of what Matthew's getting at in this is that eternal life like can happen at any time. Like it reminds me of the Gospel of Thomas, which is like not a canonical gospel, but where Christ says the kingdom of God is spread out before the eyes of men, but men don't see it. Like heaven's always available to you. It's just that there's only some times where we get into it. Today, I was thinking about bringing this up on the podcast today. I was running on the treadmill.
Go for it.
I was running on the treadmill today and just like, as I would put it, being attacked by demons mentally, like constantly. And then at some point it just started clicking. And then I was in heaven of like eternal life beginning now, just running. But anyway, that it always like
And you're in like this moment where your heart rate's up, you
yeah,
and you
yeah,
just feel good. Yeah, no, I can definitely relate.
yeah,
That would be when I'm skiing.
yeah, yeah,
I kind of, get like that, and you
yeah.
totally.
But so Matthew's just pointing out what Christ points out, that like it's kind of, and sort of what he's getting at is like ideas on their own, like heaven on its own doesn't really matter if you can't like instantiate it in earth. It's got to be like the unity of the idea and the action sort of thing.
Yeah, and that to me is really appealing. And that's where I kind of, I was probably first exposed to like indigenous spirituality in my undergrad. We had to read this book called Braiding Sweetgrass, and she basically, it was I think a science teacher in the States, and she kind of told about the world through story and sort of animated the world a little bit more. And kind of like what you're saying, it sounds appealing because, well, I guess, just from a science background, chemistry major, that kind of thing in university, when I think of even matter, and I meant to ask you, you talked about the resurrection of the body in sort of a literal sense. And like for me, that totally has sound basis in science. It's like when we die, we are going to be recycled, and we are going to live literally for eternity in terms of the molecules and what we're actually made of, and the matter that's here and how it interacts. And to me, I don't know if other people find solace in that, but like for me, it was like comforting just knowing that, I think I read this quote somewhere, like when we go in a river, we're swimming in the sea of our ancestors.
Right.
And which is kind of a weird thought, maybe a bit morbid, but also to me, it was sort of comforting in a way.
Yeah.
Because it's like, well, they've all came and gone. I'm going to have my turn. And in some ways, when I can kind of connect, as you say, sort of the heaven and the earth is not so far apart. For me, it's like kind of easier to get on board with, right, and to feel connected in a way.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I've been attending the Latin Mass, which is like, I think it's kind of something people are longing for a bit in the modern, like in our current times, of just like some kind of connection to the past. That like, when you're talking about the like almost like a river of your ancestors kind of thing, like we just don't have like, and like part of this is the kind of nuclear families being less common, people working all the time kind of thing, but like we don't really have connections to the past in ways that previous generations like prior to the 1960s probably would have had more so. So I think there's kind of a hunger for it a bit where
yeah, and kind of like the biodiversity I was mentioning earlier, it's like you don't know what you've lost because you've grown up the way things are right now.
Yeah.
And so how do you know that things were ever different?
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. The earlier when you were talking about that, it was just reminding me like the feral. Maybe I should
Feral Atlas.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it was on there, if it was in some of the notes from other people in the class, but just talking about I think it was Christina had said something about
human as an invasive species.
Yes, which I do not like. In a sense, I get it. Like, obviously, I understand why people say that.
Yeah.
But like, I just feel it's like it reminds me of like people who are against having children because the world's bad, sort of thing. Like, both of those attitudes, I just feel are so anti-human. That's like unbelievable. Because it's like, what's the logical conclusion of that? That we should just like
just not exist.
Like
it's just go away.
Yeah.
Well, and you know what? You do hear that. There's there's people that say if people just went away for 50 to 100 years, the world would regenerate.
Yeah.
And even actually during COVID, that kind of talk came up because people were like, "Oh, the skies are more blue," and I'm sure pollution actually went down when how many planes were grounded, etc. Right?
Like when you talk about biodiversity and stuff going missing and stuff, like that probably does happen, and like it would be similar to like I'm sure there's other animals that like as they dominate their environment, subsequent animals lose grounding, kind of thing. Maybe I don't know what I'm talking about, but my point with all this is just kind of like, that could entirely be true that humans have a negative effect on some species. But I just think the alternative is to get rid of humans. So I don't think it's a really tenable position to have.
So, and you've mentioned before, and I totally respect that you're, skeptical and not quick to jump to conclusions of, say, something like climate change or any other kind of environmental issue of the day. But assuming we are in a predicament, just if we kind of omit that scrutiny for a minute, how do you see sort of indigenous spirituality, Christian ethics, secularists that don't subscribe to any religion or spirituality? What does that look like when you're sort of talking about, I guess, the long-term survival of humanity and kind of the world in general in terms of the species on it.
Yeah.
Do you see any connection there, like with,
Yeah.
we talking about sort of the separation of faith and matter and what that looks like? We have in the notes here, where we had speakers like Willie Ermine and Blair Stonechild kind of mention, Christianity been around a few thousand years. Before that, human history goes for at least a couple 100,000. How do you think that all kind of fits in terms of how do we kind of move forward together, I guess, which is really the only choice we have other than not existing.
Yeah. I'm reminded right away of the Archbishop here, Don Bolin, does a lot of work with Indigenous communities. And, like, I've interviewed him a couple times. But he is really big on, like, Indigenous spirituality having such an emphasis on creation, nature, like reality itself, and how there's a lot to learn from that, basically. Do I think that human activity makes the environment worse than it needs to be, or than if humans didn't do anything? Like, yes. Like, how much of an effect that is, I don't know. But I would still say that, like, I was just talking to somebody the other day about this, how it's so, it seemed like it was impossible forever for electric cars to be on the market, and now it's just, like, it's everywhere. And so, anyway, things like that are positive.
Yeah, which was a change brought on by pressure from, environmental movements and, the ICC, all that kind of stuff. So,
and even like a crazy guy like Elon just being able to make it happen kind of with Tesla and stuff. And so anyway, I think that we should do what we can to mitigate our environmental impact, even if I am skeptical in the big picture. I just don't see why we wouldn't, at least if it's a possibility that we're causing like irreparable damage, we should probably try to limit what we can. Now, part of this is like that it would require a global effort. Like, the amount that like China or India pollutes is like not something to be ignored. Like, it's not just like the Western world would have to get their act together. And like, it's always tough when like they get rid of straws. And like,
we're doing the trivial and plastic grocery bags.
Yeah.
And then, there's the whole argument that it's like, well, a bit of hypocrisy, right? Because we've grown up on these fuels like coal and dirty fuels. And then we turn around and say, okay, well, no, you guys can't do that. You have to skip the last 150, 200 years that we had and do this. So it's a tough bargain to drive, especially if you're not living up to those principles now, right? If you're rescinding, which is a tough thing to do, right? Because you have an electric cycle every 4 years. So how do you bank on the future when people are just, it's a horse race politics, particularly so in the States, and we're doing our best to get there in Canada, at least in my opinion. It's kind of devolving into that a little bit, unfortunately.
Yeah. I mean, that's a whole separate issue, but I completely agree. Like, if you have, it's like when they make, and sometimes the environmental promises are like this, like, we're going to reduce whatever by 2050. Like, you're not going to be elected like for a huge amount.
You're not going to be held accountable.
Yeah.
Somebody might throw an egg at your retirement home window or something. Like the one guy that remembered, but
so it's always tough. But I do think that,
and it's not necessarily popular because with different things in our economy right now, like a lot of people, even the word inflation, which I didn't really hear growing up, but now a lot of people, that's the common it's in the common lexicon now, and people feel it, right? And so they're like, well, we don't, what the hell, like, you got to take care of us, human centric, before we even think about like.
And that is kind of where I'm at, and like, I'm not down on fossil fuels necessarily. It's just like perhaps stuff like nuclear could kind of be a solution. Like, again, it's like I'm not like super researched on the dangers or not dangers of it, but it's like if we have alternative ways, like if we could at the same time, like especially in Canada, like maximize our economic resources when it comes to like oil and gas, but then also be open to transitioning if that's kind of something that we have to do because it seems like we're damaging the environment. I think that's a reasonable way forward.
Yep, no, I don't disagree. Multifaceted. Okay, well, why don't we finish off with education? So yeah, kind of applying, and we're sort of dipping in there. One thing I read that was really interesting was sort of, and I think maybe we'll end on this, is the idea of vision quests.
Right.
And I kind of picked that up from Blair Stonechild, one of his works. I forget the title. I'll find it later. And just I'll just kind of describe it really quick, and then maybe we can kind of bounce a few ideas here. But he describes it as, a vision quest is not inherently linked to any religion. Can be guided by an elder or spiritual leader. Elders would assist in the process of orientating the students to millennia-old practice and using their experience to assist in interpretation. It's to seek inner spiritual guidance. The seeker must come prepared with a specific intent or question when embarking on the process. The quest could occur near the end of an elementary education and involve a measure of self-preparation, self-sacrifice, and discipline. At the beginning level, this could even be a minimum of 1 day of fasting. And it was kind of interesting. I was looking at like the grade 8 curriculum here, and Blair kind of mentioned in the article, it's he raises the question. He says something around the like of, are we missing sort of a spiritual component to assessment and what we teach, and sort of how we're getting kids to kind of conduct their lives, or at least showing them how to conduct their lives.
Yeah, I would.
Any thoughts on that?
I would entirely agree with him on that last point. That as a child, you get evaluated in large part on your school performance, and then as an adult in large part on your economic performance. And I hate when people kind of talk in ways that are like every decision you make is an economic one, that kind of, because it's like, yeah, that's true sort of, but like it's a horrible way to,
but to monetize everything.
Yeah. And like a person might be not even that motivated by money, but perhaps status in their work. And my point with all this is just that if the spiritual component is, you can't really leave the spiritual component alone. Like maybe you could for a few years, but like sooner or later it'll come back to get you, I think. Where if you're not taking care of the entire human person, you're going to have problems in one form or another. And then with the vision quest stuff, I think it's really interesting, and I'm really reminded of like Christian, like they call them the Desert Fathers. So this is maybe like 400s, 500s in I think it starts in Egypt, but these are basically just monks that are like living in caves and fasting and like going to war with the demons for their whole life kind of thing, which like I've done a couple 24-hour fasts recently.
Sorry, they were Christians.
Yeah.
Okay, because I was thinking Buddhist monks now too.
Okay.
And even that kind of. But anyway, go on.
I wouldn't be surprised if they have a similar kind of fasting thing like Buddhists as well. I'm just guessing, but it doesn't surprise me that fasting is a component of the vision quest.
Of even, what Blair mentions too.
Because like I would put it in Christian terms, like if you do fast, you will like have basically a spiritual experience. And this gets more into like the mind-body unity, which I think anyone who works out understands too, that like your mental clarity is improved by your physical well-being sort of thing. But the vision quest stuff, if you fast even, and it's not like, even if you're just fasting at your house and doing a normal day of work or whatever, you'll definitely have positive and negative spiritual experiences. Like you'll have to battle with thoughts that you have, but you also probably have like moments of like real light where you kind of have clarity about certain things. So I think if people wanted to do the vision quest and it was set up in a way that is like you have an elder or just somebody, it doesn't have to be an indigenous thing. Like it could be whatever.
It sounds fairly ubiquitous amongst other religions and practices.
Yeah, but you just have some kind of guide who can kind of like direct your mind or spirit or however you want to put it as you're going through this physical process. So it is interesting when like it reminds me Vatican II is the most recent Catholic church-wide council, and one of the things they say in there is that the other world religions have rays of truth is the quote from it. But obviously they're saying we believe we have the full version of God's revelation to humanity, the Catholics, but all these other religions have elements that are like massively true. And so it's not like it has to be an either or when it comes to something like the vision quest. It's like I can look at the vision quest and be like, that would definitely be a spiritual practice that would like help you, I would say, get closer to God kind of thing. And I think it's perfectly compatible with Catholic teaching on that issue. So I do think it's like a very interesting
and I think even like sort of just the way Blair writes it, even I think he kind of leaves it open to not just an indigenous spiritual perspective, but also and to me I kind of have the connotation that it is sort of a individualist would you say it's an individualistic kind of journey, I guess, that you're on when you're on a vision quest? Like, to me, the whole thing kind of sounds.
That's where I feel like the guide would be really important, like an elder or like someone who's just more seasoned, like a priest or like somebody who's more can like help you on it, sort of thing. So it doesn't just become a super individualistic, even though there's probably some benefit in that, I would say. But like, yeah, it would, because also if you're like really hungry, I feel like you can go astray. This is where like the Desert Fathers would be battling the demons kind of thing, where it would be useful to have somebody who kind of give you some guardrails and perhaps make it a less individualistic thing for you.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, kind of help you along. And to me, it's sort of, the same thing when you have somebody helping you when you're running a thesis or something like that,
Right.
and you have a mentor there that's going to give you some of the readings. And even frankly, the course that I'm taking right now, you just have somebody kind of putting out little breadcrumbs for you to kind of nibble on and see, and you kind of take it from there. And
Yeah.
the whole point, you never know what you're going to get from it. You're not going to get the same thing that your prof did or whoever else that came before you, and you
Right.
kind of take it your own way.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have anything else for you, Dan.
Cool. I feel like that's a good place to end it.
Yeah, I think it's a good place to kind of finish off. Well, thanks a lot for saying yes. I'm
Yeah,
glad
well,
that
no,
you
thanks
glad
for
that it
having
worked
me.
out. Yeah, you've given me a lot to think about.
I'm
so.
impressed. You got all the technical aspects down using Reaper.
Well, we still have to edit it, so we'll see. Yeah, actually, I think I forgot to hit the record button. So, do you mind? Can you
We'll just
say
run it back.
everything
Yeah.
that you just said again, please?
But yeah, no, thanks for having me. It was awesome. Thanks for listening to me
Yeah.
ramble about Logos and
Yeah, yeah, it was nice to catch up in an authentic way.
yeah, for sure.